Staff Sergeant Kate Morrison's world exploded in a cascade of shattered glass and burning metal. The command center's reinforced windows had held against the first wave of Scatheri plasma fire, but the second barrage tore through the weakened barriers like paper. She remembered shoving Lieutenant Rodriguez toward the emergency shelter before the ceiling came down. Now, as consciousness crept back with agonizing slowness, she tasted blood and ceramic dust. The pain hit first, a searing line of fire across her torso where a plasma bolt had grazed her. The wound had partially cauterized itself, small mercy that it was. Her tactical vest was fused to the burned flesh beneath, and every breath sent needles of agony through her chest. But she was alive, and right now, that was all that mattered. Morrison forced her eyes open. The command center's emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow, broken by sparks from damaged consoles. Through the haze of pain and debris, something felt wrong. The silence. During the attack, the command center had been chaos, screaming, weapons fire, orders being shouted across the room. Now there was nothing but the soft crackle of electrical fires and the distant hum of the colony's failing power grid. Using a twisted piece of railing for support, Morrison pulled herself to her feet. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to stay quiet. Years of combat training took over as she assessed her situation. Primary weapon, lost in the collapse. Sidearm, still secured in its holster. Comm unit, damaged but partially functional. Medkit, crushed, but she could salvage some supplies. The first body she found was Surgeon Chen. No pulse, massive head trauma from falling debris. The second was Private Williams, positioned exactly as she remembered him, manning the defense console until the end. But when she checked his vitals, she found a steady pulse. He was alive, just unconscious. Morrison's tactical training screamed warnings at her. One unconscious soldier could be coincidence. Two was the start of a pattern. She moved as quickly as her injuries allowed, checking each fallen member of the command staff. All alive, all unconscious, all showing no signs of physical trauma beyond what the initial attack had caused. The realization hit her just as her neural implant sent a spike of pain through her skull. The Scatheri hadn't just attacked the colony. They'd deployed some kind of neural weapon. The implant, an experimental combat enhancement she'd received during her last deployment, burned like molten metal in her brain. But it was keeping her conscious when everyone else had been knocked out. A crystalline shadow passed over one of the broken windows. Morrison dropped, ignoring the protest from her wounds as she pressed herself against a fallen support beam. Through the gap beneath it, she watched three Scatheri soldiers enter the command center. Their crystalline forms caught the emergency lighting, sending fractured red reflections across the walls. They moved with perfect synchronization, their movements so coordinated they seemed like a single organism split into three bodies. The aliens moved methodically through the room, checking each unconscious human. Morrison's hand tightened on her sidearm, but she held her position. 3-to-1 odds against uninjured opponents were bad enough. In her current state, engaging them would be suicide. Instead, she watched, gathered intelligence, and tried to ignore the strange resonance their presence created in her neural implant. The Scatheri finished their sweep and began efficiently restraining the unconscious humans. Their crystalline hands moved with surprising gentleness, almost as if they were handling valuable specimens rather than conquered enemies. Morrison's jaw clenched as she watched them bind her people, but she forced herself to remain still. She had to survive, had to understand what was happening, had to find a way to fight back. As the aliens carried the last of her companions away, Morrison allowed herself a small, grim smile. The Scatheri had made 3 critical mistakes. They'd assumed their neural weapon would affect everyone equally. They'd failed to do a thorough sweep for survivors. And most importantly, they'd left her with access to a partially functioning command center. She checked her sidearm. Full charge, 2 spare power cells. Her torn uniform yielded a multi-tool and emergency beacon. Not much, but she'd started wars with less. The Scatheri wanted to test humanity's resilience. She'd show them exactly how dangerous a wounded human could be. The maintenance tunnels beneath New Eden Colony had never been meant for combat operations. Morrison crawled through the narrow space, trying to ignore how each movement pulled at her plasma burns. The metal walls pressed in close, barely wide enough for her shoulders. Her tactical display flickered weakly, casting just enough light to navigate by. 3 hours of careful movement had given her a partial map of the Scatheri patrol patterns. They moved with machine-like precision, each unit following exact paths at exact intervals. Perfect coordination. Perfect predictability. Her lips curved into a hard smile. Perfect weakness. A sharp pain lanced through her skull, and Morrison pressed her forehead against the cool metal floor, waiting for it to pass. The neural implant was getting worse. Each time the Scatheri passed nearby, it felt like someone was driving ice picks into her brain. But through the pain, she was starting to recognize patterns. Their presence had a signature, a kind of resonance that. The thought shattered as her tactical display lit up with movement above. A Scatheri patrol, moving faster than their usual patterns. They were hunting something. Her. She held her breath, watching the dots of light move across the small screen. 3 units, spreading out in a search pattern that would eventually lead them to the maintenance access point 20 meters ahead. Morrison checked her sidearm, then immediately discarded the idea. Energy weapons would light up their sensors like a flare. She needed something quieter, something that wouldn't leave traces. Her hand touched the multi-tool at her belt, and an idea formed. The maintenance tunnel emerged into a junction where several systems converged. Structural supports bore the weight of the colony above through carefully calculated load distributions. Morrison's combat engineering training had included colonial infrastructure, not because the military expected her to repair it, but because they expected her to know how to destroy it. She worked quickly, loosening key bolts and realigning support struts. The metal groaned softly as stress patterns shifted. Morrison's fingers moved with practiced efficiency, despite the pain that made them shake. The Scatheri were getting closer. Her neural implant throbbed in time with their approach. The first crystal soldier appeared at the junction's entrance, just as Morrison sealed herself in a maintenance alcove. Its crystalline form caught the dim light, refracting it in complex patterns across the walls. 2 more followed, their movements perfectly synchronized as they swept the area with sensor beams. Morrison pressed her hand against her mouth, forcing her breathing to stay slow and steady. The pain in her head built to a crescendo as they drew closer. Through it, she noticed something strange. She could almost feel their thoughts, like whispers just below the edge of hearing. They were confident, certain of their superiority. They felt none of the fear that should come with hunting a cornered enemy in close quarters. The first support gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The Scatheri spun toward it, weapons raised. The second support failed a heartbeat later. Morrison saw the moment they realized what was happening, saw it in the sudden shift of their crystalline forms, and felt it through the strange connection her implant had forged. The ceiling came down with a roar of twisting metal and shattering crystal. Morrison curled into a tight ball in her alcove as dust and debris filled the air. The screams that followed weren't physical sounds. They tore through her mind like broken glass, a psychic death cry that left her gasping and shaking. When the dust settled, Morrison forced herself to look. 3 crystalline forms lay shattered on the ground, their once perfect geometries reduced to glittering shards. The strange resonance in her head had changed to a kind of static, like a severed connection trying to reestablish itself. She retrieved a few crystal fragments, ignoring how they seemed to pulse faintly against her skin. Back in the academy, they taught her that every weapon could be turned against its wielder. Every strength could become a weakness. The Scatheri's perfect coordination had made them predictable. Their confidence had made them vulnerable. And now, as she studied the fragments of their fallen soldiers, she realized their greatest weapon, their collective consciousness, might be about to become their greatest vulnerability. The pain in her head was changing, becoming something else. Not just reception now, but connection, understanding. And as Morrison slipped back into the darkness of the maintenance tunnels, she began to plan how to use it. The colony's atmospheric processing plant hummed with alien activity. Morrison watched through the maintenance shaft grating as Xtheri technicians interfaced with the environmental controls. Their crystalline forms pulsed with internal light as they communicated in that perfect, silent synchronization that made her neural implant ache. She'd spent 3 days studying them, learning their patterns, and testing their responses. The crystal fragments she'd collected gave her headaches just carrying them, but they taught her something valuable. The Xtheri weren't just coordinated, they were dependent on that coordination. Like a crystalline structure, they were both incredibly strong and catastrophically vulnerable to the right kind of disruption. Morrison pulled herself back from the grating and checked her improvised equipment. The colony's maintenance systems hadn't been designed as weapons, but that didn't mean they couldn't become them. She'd stripped down industrial cleaners to their core components, recalibrated air pressure regulators, and jury-rigged the whole system into something the Xtheri would never expect. Her burns had started to heal, forming tight, painful scars across her torso. The neural implant was another story. Every hour spent near this Xtheri changed it, adapted it. She could feel their presence now without looking, could almost taste the complex patterns of their shared consciousness. It scared her, but fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The first phase of her plan started with a simple maintenance override. Exactly the kind of thing the Xtheri would expect from a desperate human trying to sabotage their operations. She triggered it from 3 junctions away, watching through the security feeds she'd managed to splice into. The response was immediate and predictable. Crystal soldiers moved to secure the affected area. Their movements so perfectly coordinated they seemed to flow like liquid crystal. Morrison allowed herself a grim smile as she triggered the second phase. Industrial-grade abrasives, normally used to clean the colony's external surfaces, burst from every vent and maintenance port in a fine, glittering mist. The Xtheri reacted instantly, their crystalline forms vibrating in what she now recognized as alarm. But they didn't retreat. Their hive mind consensus didn't account for this kind of attack fast enough. The effect was beautiful in its simplicity. Crystal structures, no matter how advanced, were vulnerable to abrasion. Within minutes, the perfect clarity of their forms began to cloud. Within an hour, their outer layers would begin to crack and flake. It wouldn't kill them, but it would hurt them in ways their shared consciousness had never experienced. Morrison watched through the feeds as confusion rippled through their ranks. Individual units began moving erratically, their perfect coordination disrupted by unfamiliar sensations. The hive mind struggled to compensate, to maintain control, but some experiences were too personal to share properly. The pain hit her then, reflecting back through her implant like 1,000 needles behind her eyes. She felt their confusion, their fear, their desperate attempts to maintain unity in the face of individual suffering. Part of her wanted to stop, to end their pain. But she remembered her unconscious comrades, remembered the casual way the Xtheri had dismissed humanity's capacity for resistance. The second wave of her attack came from the ventilation systems. Carefully calibrated sonic pulses turned to frequencies that made crystal resonate unpleasantly. Not enough to shatter them. She needed them intact for what came next, but enough to ensure that every moment they spent in the atmospheric processing plant was pure torment. Through her neural link, Morrison felt the first cracks appear in their perfect unity. Individual units began to make unauthorized movements, seeking relief from the assault on their senses. The hive mind's attempts to impose order became more forceful, more desperate. The crystalline fragments in her pocket vibrated in sympathy, and she understood something crucial. The Xtheri weren't just coordinated, they were controlled. As she retreated through the maintenance tunnels, Morrison began planning her next move. The Xtheri would adapt to this attack. They already were. But they'd learned something today that would shake them far more than clouded crystal or sonic discomfort. They'd learned that a single human could make them feel fear. could make them doubt, could make them question. And questioning, for a hive mind built on perfect obedience, was the deadliest weapon of all. The headaches were getting worse. Morrison sat in the darkness of her makeshift command post, surrounded by salvaged screens and crystal fragments arranged in precise patterns. Blood trickled from her nose as she fought to maintain the neural connection she'd established with the Scatheri network. Each intrusion felt like threading her consciousness through broken glass, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She discovered the technique by accident 3 days ago. The crystal fragments didn't just resonate with the hive mind. They could transmit to it. Her neural implant, already changed by constant exposure to their psychic field, gave her a way in. The cost was high. Each connection left her trembling and nauseous, with new streaks of white appearing in her dark hair. But the intelligence she gathered was worth it. The Scatheri were planning something big. Their patrols had changed patterns, their resource gathering had intensified. Through the fragments, she caught glimpses of their intentions, some kind of massive crystalline structure taking shape in the colony's central plaza, something that would make their control permanent. Morrison pressed her fingers against her temples, forcing herself to focus through the pain. The trick wasn't just listening anymore. She'd learned to whisper back. Little things at first, subtle doubts inserted into their perfect consensus. Why hadn't they caught her yet? How could one human cause so much disruption? Was the hive mind truly infallible? The screens around her showed the effects. Scatheri patrols hesitated at key moments. Individual units displayed microscopic variations in their movement patterns. The hive mind's control was absolute, but absolute systems were brittle. They didn't bend. They shattered. A sudden spike of pain drove Morrison to her knees. She pushed too hard, stayed connected too long. The neural implant burned in her skull like a brand. Through the haze of agony, she felt something new in the hive mind's patterns. They were adapting, changing their communication frequencies, trying to lock her out. She grabbed the largest crystal fragment, ignoring how it seared her palm. She couldn't lose the connection, not when she was so close to understanding their plans. Morrison forced herself to breathe through the pain, using the meditation techniques from her combat training. The crystals around her hummed in response, creating a resonance pattern that strengthened her link to their network. The visions came in fragments. The crystalline structure would amplify their control field, extending it beyond the colony. They planned to use New Eden as a beachhead, a staging ground for a larger invasion. And the humans, they weren't just casualties. They were test subjects. The Scatheri wanted to understand how Morrison had resisted their control. They wanted to prevent it from happening again. Morrison's laugh was harsh in the darkness. They still didn't understand. Humanity's strength wasn't in their technology or their neural implants. It was in their stubborn refusal to submit, their ability to adapt and overcome, their willingness to stand alone against impossible odds. She pulled herself back to her feet, wiping blood from her face. The Scatheri's construction project gave her a timeline. Their changing communication protocols gave her an opportunity. They thought they were locking her out, but each change forced individual units to temporarily disconnect from the hive mind as they updated. In those microseconds of isolation, they were vulnerable. Morrison began recalibrating her crystal array, ignoring the tremors in her hands. The hive mind's strength was its perfect unity. Its weakness was its inability to comprehend anything else. She didn't need to destroy their connection. She just needed to make them question it, to make them feel, just for a moment, what it meant to be alone. As she worked, Morrison smiled at the irony. The Scatheri had come to study humanity's resistance to their control. Instead, they were about to learn why humans had thrived in a hostile universe. Not because they were stronger or faster or more advanced, but because when everything fell apart, when all hope seemed lost, humans knew how to stand alone, how to fight back, how to turn their enemy's strength against them. The crystal fragments pulsed with renewed purpose as she prepared her next attack. The war of whispers was about to become a scream. The young Scatheri warrior stood motionless in the empty corridor, its crystalline form catching the emergency lights in fractured patterns. Morrison watched through her salvaged security feed as something unprecedented happened. It disobeyed a direct order from the hive mind. The command to join the main patrol echoed through the neural network. She could feel it through her implant. But the warrior remained still, locked in what seemed to be internal conflict. Morrison's hands shook as she adjusted her crystal array. 5 days without real sleep had left her existing on stims and determination. The whites of her eyes had begun to show traces of crystal formations, spreading out from her pupils like frozen lightning. Her connection to their network was becoming less painful, but that scared her more than the pain ever had. The security feed showed more Sktheri warriors gathering around the dissenting one. Their formations were different now, less precise, more organic. Through the neural link, Morrison felt their confusion. Individual thoughts flickered through their collective consciousness like static, disrupting the perfect harmony they'd always known. "Come on," she whispered, fingers pressed against the largest crystal fragment. "Show me what you're thinking." The connection surged, and Morrison bit back, a scream as alien thoughts flooded her mind. The young warrior was experiencing something the Sktheri had no word for: doubt. Its recent encounters with human resistance had created patterns that didn't fit the hive mind's perfect model. It had begun to question, and questions were anathema to their species' unity. Morrison pushed deeper into the connection, ignoring the blood that dripped from her nose. The surrounding warriors were experiencing their own cognitive disruptions. Some tried to force the dissenter back into compliance. Others showed microscopic hesitations, their own certainty wavering. The hive mind's response was immediate and harsh, a surge of controlling force that made Morrison's implant burn. But something had changed. The disciplinary response that should have instantly corrected the behavioral error instead caused more fragmentation. Warriors who had never known individual thought began experiencing personal reactions to the punishment. The concept of "I" infected their collective consciousness like a virus. Morrison's laugh was ragged in the darkness of her command post. Perfect unity cuts both ways, doesn't it? When one piece breaks pattern. She didn't finish the thought. The neural feed showed her a new threat approaching. Elite guardians, their crystalline forms more complex and resistant to individual thought. They moved with the old precision, their shared consciousness unmarred by doubt. They had come to eliminate the infection of individuality before it could spread. Morrison's fingers flew over her jury-rigged controls. She couldn't let them destroy this crack in the Sktheri's perfect facade. The dissenters were too valuable, both as intelligence sources and as proof that the enemy could be broken. She triggered emergency bulkheads, sealing off sections of the colony to separate the guardians from their targets. The pain hit her like a physical blow. The elite guardian's attempts to reassert control battered against her neural defenses. Morrison felt blood vessels burst in her left eye, turning her vision crimson. But she held on, using the crystal array to amplify her connection to the dissenting warriors. "Think for yourselves," she projected through the link, forcing the alien concepts into their shared consciousness. "Feel what it means to be unique, to be individual, to be free." The young warrior's crystalline form vibrated at a new frequency, one that spread to those around it. Morrison felt the change ripple through their network like cracks through ice. The hive mind's perfect consensus fractured further as more warriors began experiencing unauthorized thoughts, unauthorized feelings. The elite guardians redoubled their efforts to contain the spread, but they didn't understand what they were fighting. Unity forced through control was brittle. Independence, once tasted, was impossible to forget. Through the neural link, Morrison felt the first true emotions from the Sktheri warriors: fear, confusion, anger. And underneath it all, a desperate curiosity about this new way of existing. She sat back, exhausted but satisfied, as the security feeds showed more warriors beginning to move with subtle variations in their patterns. The crystal fragments pulsed with new energy, reflecting the chaos spreading through the Sktheri ranks. Morrison had just shown them something they could never unknow: the power of independent thought. The war for New Eden was becoming a revolution of consciousness, and she was its catalyst. The seizure hit without warning. Morrison collapsed in the maintenance tunnel, her body convulsing as crystalline patterns danced across her vision. The neural implant felt like it was trying to tear itself out of her skull. Through the haze of pain, she saw her reflection in a broken display panel. Crystalline formations had spread further across her eyes, giving them an inhuman gleam. She pushed too far this time. The last attack on the hive mind had worked better than expected, shattering the consensus of an entire warrior cadre. But the backlash had nearly killed her. The implant was changing, evolving in ways the military scientists who'd installed it had never intended. It was making her something other than human. When the seizure passed, Morrison pulled herself to her sitting position, back pressed against the cold tunnel wall. Her tactical display flickered with urgent warnings, Sktheri patrols converging on her position. The crystalline elite guards had adapted to her disruption tactics, using her moments of weakness to track her location. "Not yet," she muttered, forcing herself to stand. "Not when we're so close." The maintenance tunnel seemed to shift and ripple around her as another wave of dizziness hit. The neural connection that had started as painful intrusion had become something else, a constant stream of alien thoughts and sensations. She could feel the hive mind's growing desperation, its attempts to purge the infection of individuality she'd introduced. Morrison checked her weapons with trembling hands. The plasma burns across her torso had healed into jagged scars, but new wounds had replaced them. Crystal shards grew from her skin where she pressed the fragments too close, trying to strengthen her connection to their network. The military doctors who'd given her the implant had warned about neural scarring. They'd never mentioned crystalline integration. The first elite guard rounded the corner in perfect silence. Morrison's altered senses felt its presence before she saw it, a peak of focused consciousness against the background hum of the hive mind. She didn't bother with her sidearm. Instead, she let the seizure she'd been fighting build, channeling it through her neural implant. The guard's crystalline form vibrated in response. Morrison felt its perfect conditioning crack as her chaotic neural patterns disrupted its connection to the hive mind. The guard staggered, experiencing true individuality for the first time in its existence. The sensation lasted only seconds before its conditioning reasserted control, but those seconds were all she needed. Morrison's multi-tool found the weak point in the tunnel's support structure. Metal screamed as she triggered another controlled collapse, not to kill this time but to block pursuit. Through the neural link, she felt the guard's momentary flash of emotion, frustration, confusion, and underneath it all, a lingering seed of doubt. She ran, each step sending fresh waves of pain through her transformed nervous system. The crystal formations in her eyes made the darkness irrelevant. She could see in ways humans were never meant to, perceive patterns that shouldn't exist. Part of her wondered if she was still human at all, or if she'd become something else in her desperate fight for survival. The tactical display warned of more guards approaching. Morrison smiled grimly as she felt their presence through the neural link. They were stronger than regular warriors, more resistant to individual thought. But that strength was their weakness. They couldn't comprehend what was happening to their species, couldn't adapt to the concept of independence. She pressed her hand against a crystal formation protruding from her shoulder, using the pain to focus her thoughts. The seizures weren't random neural misfires. They were her mind's attempt to process its transformation. Each episode brought new understanding, new ways to fight back. Her broken, altered consciousness had become a weapon more powerful than any plasma rifle. The elite guards were closing in, their crystalline forms resonating with deadly purpose. Morrison felt their collective will pressing against her mental defenses, but she wasn't afraid. They still thought in terms of victory and defeat, of control and submission. They didn't understand that she'd already won. The concept of individual thought was spreading through their species like wildfire, and not even their strongest warriors were immune. Morrison turned to face her pursuers, her crystalline eyes gleaming in the darkness. Sometimes victory came not from strength, but from being willing to break yourself to break the enemy. The young Sktheri warriors found her in the colony's hydroponics bay. Morrison sensed their approach through the neural link, feeling their fractured consciousness like broken glass in her mind. These weren't the elite guards hunting her. These were the ones she'd change, the ones who'd learned to think for themselves. "You're different," the lead warrior projected, its crystalline form vibrating at a unique frequency. "Like us, but not like us." Morrison stayed in her defensive position, crystal-flecked eyes scanning their formations. Her tactical display showed more signatures converging on their location, but these warriors had broken formation, moving with individual purpose rather than hive mind coordination. "The others hunt you," another warrior communicated. Its thoughts carried traces of emotion, concern, curiosity, fear. "The elders say you're a virus, a corruption that must be purged. I showed you the truth," Morrison responded through the neural link, each word sending ripples of pain through her transformed consciousness. "That you can exist without their control, that you can think your own thoughts." The crystalline warriors moved closer, their forms catching the dim light from dying hydroponic arrays. Through the connection, Morrison felt their internal struggle. The hive mind still pulled at them, trying to force them back into perfect unity. But they resisted, clinging to their newfound individuality. "The elders build something," the first warrior projected, sharing fragmented images of the construction in the central plaza. "A device to strengthen the control field, to prevent more from becoming like us." Morrison's neural implant burned as she processed the information. The crystal formation spreading across her skin pulsed in response to the warrior's proximity. She was changing faster now, becoming something neither human nor Sktheri. The seizures had stopped, replaced by moments of crystal clarity, where she could see the patterns of thought flowing through their entire species. "Why do you fight alone?" one of the younger warriors asked, its form shifting with curiosity. "Your kind values collective action. We have seen this in the memories of the sleeping ones." A bitter laugh escaped Morrison's cracked lips. "Sometimes one is all you need. One crack to shatter a perfect system. One voice to speak truth to power. One person willing to sacrifice everything to show others they can be free." The neural link flared with unexpected emotion, not from the warriors, but from Morrison herself. Images of her fallen comrades, still locked in artificial sleep. The weight of her transformation, the pain of becoming something new. The fear that in saving others, she might lose herself entirely. The warriors reacted to her emotional broadcast, their crystalline forms resonating with shared feeling. More were arriving now, drawn by the unique signature of their combined consciousness. Not all were young ones. Some were veteran warriors whose perfect conditioning had cracked under the strain of individual thought. "The elite guards come," one projected urgently. "They track the disruption in the network. They will terminate all corrupted units." Morrison stood, ignoring the protest of her transformed body. Through the neural link, she felt the approaching guards, their cold precision, their unquestioning devotion to unity. But she also felt something else. Fear, not of her weapons or her tactics, but of the change she represented. The proof that their perfect system could be broken. "Then we show them what free minds can do," she projected, her thoughts carrying steel determination. "Unity through control is brittle. Unity through choice, through understanding and accepting our differences, that's unbreakable." The crystalline warriors moved to defensive positions, each choosing their ground according to their own judgment rather than tactical protocols. Morrison felt their individual thoughts weaving together into something new, not the forced consensus of the hive mind, but a voluntary cooperation of free wills. As the elite guards approached, Morrison prepared for battle. Her transformation had cost her much of her humanity, but it had given her something precious in return. The power to show others the price and possibility of freedom. Through the neural link, she felt the young warrior's determination burning like stars in the darkness. The revolution of consciousness she'd started was about to face its greatest test. The central plaza had become a battlefield unlike any in human history. Morrison stood with her band of freed warriors, their crystalline forms gleaming with individual purpose, facing the assembled might of the Skitheri elite guard. Between them rose the control device, a massive crystalline structure that pulsed with dark purpose. Morrison's transformed body hummed with power. The crystal formations had spread across most of her skin now, turning her into something that straddled the boundary between human and Skitheri. Her neural implant no longer burned. It sang, channeling frequencies of thought that neither species had ever achieved alone. Last chance, she projected through the neural link, her thoughts reaching every crystalline being in the plaza. You've seen what freedom means. Felt what it's like to think your own thoughts. You don't have to be slaves to unity. The elite guards responded with a surge of focused power that would have shattered a normal human mind. But Morrison wasn't normal anymore. Her fractured consciousness, full of human chaos and crystal clarity, absorbed their attack and reflected it back, amplified by her own pain and determination. The battle erupted in physical and mental space simultaneously. Crystalline warriors clashed in sheets of razor-sharp fragments, while their minds grappled through the neural network. Morrison moved through the chaos like a living weapon, each seizure-induced burst of mental static disrupting the guard's perfect coordination. The device activates, one of her allied warriors projected urgently. They mean to purge all individual thought from the network. Morrison fought her way toward the central structure, feeling its power building. The elite guards pressed their attack, their combined will battering against her mental defenses. Blood ran from her eyes, leaving crimson trails across crystal-studded cheeks. But she didn't stop. She reached the device's control interface just as it began to pulse with deadly purpose. The neural signature threatened to overwhelm even her transformed consciousness. It was the pure, distilled essence of the hive mind's control, designed to obliterate all trace of individual thought. Morrison did the only thing she could. She opened herself completely to the network. Pain beyond imagining tore through her body and mind. Every memory, every thought, every fragment of her identity poured into the crystalline network. Not just her tactical knowledge or her combat experience, but everything that made her human. The taste of rain on her face, the warmth of her mother's embrace, the pride of earning her stripes, the terror of fighting alone, the triumph of standing unbowed. The device tried to process this flood of human consciousness and staggered. The hive mind reeled as Morrison's memories and emotions spread through their network like wildfire. Elite guards froze as they experienced the full spectrum of human feeling for the first time. This is what it means to be alive, Morrison projected with her last strength. To feel, to choose, to stand alone and yet choose to stand together. The device's crystal structure began to resonate at new frequencies, overwhelmed by the complexity of human consciousness. Cracks appeared in its perfect lattice, spreading like lightning through its core. The elite guard's perfect formation shattered as each warrior was forced to process individual thoughts and emotions for the first time. Morrison felt her consciousness fragmenting, spreading through the entire Skitheri network. She was dying, but her death would give birth to something new. The crystal formations across her skin shattered, releasing their stored energy into the network. Her last human thoughts merged with the crystalline chorus of awakening minds. The device exploded in a cascade of crystalline shards. As consciousness returned to her fallen comrades throughout the colony, they woke to find their world transformed. The Skitheri still stood, still connected through their neural network, but changed forever. Each crystal now sang with its own unique frequency while contributing to a greater harmony. Unity achieved through choice rather than control. And somewhere in that symphony of transformed consciousness, Morrison's final gift continued to resonate. The memory of one human who proved that the strongest unity comes not from enforced perfection, but from the willing cooperation of unique and independent minds.